Hello, I'm Bruce Zimmerman, and this is the Open Line Garden Show podcast for this week. Now, on Thursday, June 21st, we attended the Rose Garden grand reopening, I guess you'd say. There has always been a rose garden at the Royal Botanical Gardens, but this one was the redesigned rose garden. Now, what happened was this. With roses, the movement has been towards the more disease resistance. In Ontario, we don't have the pesticides that we used to have to look after diseases, particularly those on roses or even the bugs. So we needed roses that were more sustainable in the environment and in our gardens. So they redesigned the rose garden to accommodate this feature. Now, here's the problem. The soil in the rose garden was basically overused, infected with everything going under the sun that went after the roses, because the roses and the rose garden had been there for decades. Now, this meant the removal of soil, not just the top little bit, but lots. We're quite literally down several feet in order to ensure that the old diseases and bugs, etc., were not carried over from the old garden to the new garden. It then had to be redesigned for walkways to accommodate people with wheelchairs, but also larger crowds, as this is probably the main entrance into the gardens through the tunnel, and there is the old tea house, been renovated, and, of course, the rose garden. Now, there's a central pond. Now, these are reflecting ponds. They have been dyed blue so that they do reflect the light. And it cuts down on, of course, the algae and other things that grow in the water. Now, with that, there is now wider walkways, and they're all curved, and they bend, and they're all divided up into segments. Now, in each segment, you'll probably find several different roses that have been, let's say, knowledgeably selected for disease and insect resistance. The center part of the garden, the roses are bigger and, of course, taller and wider. And then as you move out towards the edges and the edge of the beds, you'll see smaller, more short, almost ground cover roses. So what they've done is made them most visibly attractive. Now, they haven't picked the roses by color. They've picked them for the disease and insect resistance, and of course placed them by size. As you go along through, you'll suddenly see other perennials. Now, the perennials have been put there in a block as an enhancement to the rose garden. In other words, these are plants that, for one reason or another, protect the roses from insects and disease. So they have gone and done a more substantial and sustainable garden for roses. So make notes on the plants that you see growing in association with the roses, because they should be the ones that you use in your home garden as well, near the roses. Now, there isn't more than, let's say, 10 or 12 roses of one kind in each bed. Now, there can be several roses in each bed. So this means that you're going to be able to view different roses from different groups, and of course different sizes and shapes and colors, making it far more interesting. You'll also find that by doing this, you've got that sculpted landscape, which allows you to see more visually across the bed. And that's important, particularly if you think that if you're going to build a rose garden that has to be viewed basically throughout the growing season, it has to be attractive. And it also has to be attractive to people, let's say, who are shorter, simply because of wheelchairs, etc. So mobility has been considered, and at the same time, the viewing height has also been considered as well. When you get through this whole garden, you're going to go, wow, because there is about 2,500 roses in the garden. Now, there isn't 2,500 different roses. Basically, they are planted in small drifts of about 10 or 12, right? So you'll see that you do get a lot of different roses, all selected for disease and insect resistance. Now, we don't want to call it a test garden. I tried to call it a test garden, and they said, no, we don't want to call it a test garden. It's not really. We know these plants will do well, but we want to make sure that they're good, strong, and sustainable here in our climate. And they're not always. Remember that here in Ontario we have humidity, we have summer rain, and of course heat. So the roses have to be sustainable here in Ontario, in that particular garden, where all the walkways are basically a light-colored concrete. So, reflection, heat buildup, heat bounce, and of course, we're going to have them under irrigation. So, we've got all of those considerations done and worked out, and that means that some of these roses just aren't going to make it. And this is not unusual. They have selected roses that they know that are disease and insect resistant, but they're from all over. The old roses, the old shrub roses that are from the outside edge, you'll see them. They have the sort of confused center, like the David Austin roses. And these shrubs are actually from Texas. So they were actually brought in from Texas, grown in Texas, and basically planted here. So we have to go and see, will they move well in from their climate to ours? But each of the different ones, most of the roses that you see in this garden are from the United States. So this means that that's where they were grown. It doesn't mean that's where they were bred, but that's where they were grown. There are several rose varieties in that garden that were grown more locally. J.C. Backer did contribute roses there. Palatines did contribute roses there. In fact, the Poseidon, which is one of the best looking lavender roses, was actually produced and grown by Palatine. And Navy Lady was from J.C. Backer. And there are others. But there's a lot of star roses in there, which are all from the States. There's Weeks roses from the States. And of course the David Austin roses and the shrub roses were all grown in Texas. So we have to see, are they sustainable? Will they do well in this garden? And if not, a substitute will have to be found. And that is pretty good because there is more and more of these roses being bred. Many of the roses you see now that you don't recognize the name of are, in fact, those that are disease and insect resistant and bred other places. And in talking to the people of Palatine's, they said that one of the trends that they've got in breeding of the roses that they see is that some of the best roses, and over the last, I would say, decade or a decade and a half, have actually been grown and, of course, bred by individuals. These are gardeners, these are geneticists, they're people who are on their own breeding roses for these factors. And when they do come up with a good one, very often what happens is that they can't market it themselves, they can't get it out, and they can't produce enough. So they go to one of the great big houses that are for marketing and growing, and they sell the rights to it. Now, I don't know if I would sell the rights to it, but a lot of them do. And they get paid a set amount of money, and then, of course, the marketing house actually owns the rose and gets all the rights and propagation fees, etc. So, that's great. But you've got to be able to test a rose in a garden for up to 3 to 5 years, according to Palatine's, in order to truly see what it does. And they've seen this. And they gave an example of one of the roses that we all know. And that is the Canadian Shield Rose. Canadian Shield Rose goes all the way across Canada. It's part of the 49th collection. But they planted it in front of the British Columbia Parliament, basically, the house, the government houses, and they fell apart. The plant quite literally was on the ground. It could not sustain itself in the environment that it found itself in British Columbia. So it grew, it bloomed, but it laid on the ground. And it was really quite sad. They had to remove them all and replace them with other things. So that is an indication that you really need to test a rose. And if you put a rose into your garden, get one that you know has been around for 3 to 5 years, growing more locally, or at least in Ontario. And, of course, then you'll know that you're getting a rose that has a better chance to do well in your garden. So these are things that you need to consider. Also, size. Size, not just of the bloom, not just of the color, not just because of disease and insect resistance, but also just the overall height and width of a plant. You don't go and plant one of these new roses that are going to be 5 foot by 5 foot at the front of a bed when you've got plants that are shorter than that behind it. You have to pick and choose where you can put a plant that does grow 5 by 5, such as the Canadian Shield Rose, 5 by 5. Where, let's say, the Never Alone Rose that's produced by J.C. Backer, red and white, 3 foot by 3 foot. It might get 4 feet across, but it looks more 3 foot by 3 foot, and I've had it in my garden for 2 or 3 years, and it's doing well. So now I'm testing another, and that is the At Last Rose. Now, Sheridan Nurseries provided this. I'm growing it. It's doing wonderful. It's been planted in a spot, and it's going to be about 3 foot by 3 foot, and it's in my garden, and I'm going to have to grow it for at least 3 years to see just how long and how well it sustains itself. It self-cleans, which means it drops all its petals clean when their flowers are finished. They're absolutely gorgeous, and the plant itself is very, from what I can see, disease and insect resistant, but that's only initially. And remember, I was only planted in my garden this spring. but I think you'll see that it's going to do very well. I hope so. So I talked to Palatines about an old miniature rose I have in my garden, and it's called Lavender Lace. You might have a hard time finding this miniature, but it is truly a miniature, but it has large flowers that are sort of lavender pink, and very good, very hardy, very strong, very vigorous, but the leaves are a little smaller than you would expect. Hence, the American judges for miniature roses don't like it. So it's been dropped by many people because it can't win awards. But can it do well in my garden? It's been there for over 25 years. It's been moved 3 or 4 times. And it's still there. Still doing well. Still blooming. That's what you call a really good rose. Minimal care. No pesticides. No pesticides, sprays for fungus or insects. And it's still there. That's the type of rose that we're moving towards in our breeding programs throughout the world, and it's so important. So get out to RBG, get out to the rose garden. It's its first year, so it's very young, very juvenile, but it'll give you a good idea of what you're looking for to put into your garden. I'm Bruce Zimmerman. This is the Open Line Garden Show podcast for this week.